Questions orales, oral questions. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Richmond North Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said during the election campaign that he would be running a modest deficit of $10 billion a year. But what have we ended up with? $25 billion per year. This was supposed to last only 2 years, but now it's going to last for an undetermined period. The Prime Minister, once again, is demonstrating that he's being completely irresponsible with taxpayer money, and he's doing it at the expense of our children and grandchildren. So my question is simple. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians once and for all when we will finally be back and balance the budget? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, during last election, Canadians had a very simple choice to make. Two parties wanted to make cuts to balance the budget at any price, and we were proposing investing in our communities, in middle-class growth, in scientific research, in technology, in economic growth. And these are things that Canadians needed after 10 years of mismanagement by the opposite party. The reality is that we are delivering on our promises to Canadians, and we are investing together in our future. The Honourable Member for Richmond North Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, Senators are insisting that the Infrastructure Bank be studied independently. The members on this side of the House are insisting the same thing. All of the experts who have studied this bank are concerned about the risks that it places on taxpayers because they're the ones who will have to pay for it in the end. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister doesn't have anything to hide and the bank really is beyond reproach, then why is he so afraid that we study it in detail? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've been talking about this infrastructure bank for a long time. This is an election promise that we made very explicitly. We know that we need investments in infrastructure. After 10 years under the former government, we finally started making record investments up to $180 billion. And the reality is that we need to innovate as well. That's why we are setting up this infrastructure bank to allow us to build more infrastructure, whether it's for public transit, roads, ports, or other things that Canadian needs to create economic growth. The Honourable Member for Richmond North Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, we've asked the Prime Minister to tell us when he'll balance the budget, and he has nothing intelligent to say in response. And for the Infrastructure Bank, he's asking taxpayers to sign a blank check for $35 billion. This just doesn't make any sense. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are irresponsible, and they're acting carelessly with citizens' money. When will the Prime Minister show some respect for this institution and allow us to study this bank in detail? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member across the way is showing once again that he doesn't understand how the Canadian economy works or what Canadians need. Canadians need investments in infrastructure, whether it's public transport, affordable housing, green infrastructure. It's been 10 years that the former government across the way had underinvested in our communities. We know that we need to start investing now in an innovative manner, and that is exactly what we're doing for Canadians.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's proposed $35 billion slush fund, also known as the Liberal Infrastructure Bank, is a disaster in the making. Even worse, we've learned, according to what the Finance Minister said last week, is that this slush fund won't be run by Canadians. Can the Prime Minister please explain why he will be appointing foreigners who don't have Canada's best interest in mind to the board for the Liberal Infrastructure Bank?
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that we need investments in public transit, we need investments in social infrastructure, we need investments in green infrastructure to grow our communities, to grow our economies, to create good jobs for the middle class today and for our children and grandchildren tomorrow. That's the vision that this government has. This is what we put forward in the election campaign. This is what we continue to work on. We know that global investment can lead to better outcomes for Canadians. That's what we're focusing on drawing in.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
The Prime Minister's refusal to answer that question shows why this infrastructure bank is a complete disaster. Over the weekend, Mr. Speaker, when asked a direct question, the Prime Minister refused to say when, if ever, he plans on balancing the budget. Given that our children and our grandchildren will be the ones stuck paying off his excessive spending habits and his multi-billion-dollar tab, they deserve an honest answer to a simple question. In what year does the Prime Minister plan on balancing the budget? Will it be the year that pigs fly or the year that hell freezes over?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard all these arguments before. They were the core of the member opposite's re-election campaign. It was the core of the Conservative platform in the 2015 election, a platform soundly rejected by Canadians because it focused on balancing the budget at all costs through cuts to services and investments for Canadians. We made a commitment to invest in a brighter future through investing in infrastructure for Canadians, putting more money in the pockets of the middle class by raising taxes on the wealthiest 1%. All things that those members stood against.
Alors.
Order. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Like many Quebec mayors, the Quebec Premier is going to Washington today to talk about NAFTA negotiations. Quebec politicians don't trust the federal government anymore to lead these negotiations. And I understand, especially given the softwood lumber and the dye-filtered milk debacles. Compared to the federal government, the priorities of Quebecers are clear. Dealing with the softwood lumber file, protecting jobs, and managing supply management. When will the government tell us what the timeline is for the NAFTA renegotiations? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate my friend, Philippe Couillard, the Premier of Quebec, who, like all premiers across the country, is committed to working with the American government. We have underlined the importance of bringing together all levels of government to help the U.S. understand that Canadians are united and that we are concerned by their approach and that we are ready to stand up and to speak out in favor of Canadian interests. This is what we will all be doing, and I congratulate Premier Couillard on his initiative in going to Washington today. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. I think the Prime Minister should stop repeating the same thing and finally reassure Canadians properly.
In the dark when it comes to the renegotiation of NAFTA. Workers throughout the country are quickly losing confidence in the Liberal government and their ability to negotiate a good trade deal in their interest. In less than a month, the U.S. will reveal their final priorities, and still, Mr. Speaker, deafening silence from the government side. Canadians deserve a government that will stand up and fight for the jobs, so when will the government release their plans on the renegotiation of NAFTA?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we very much look forward to sitting down with the American side after August 18th when they have permission to sit down and start negotiating. Until then, we have made it very clear. Our priorities are defending Canada's interests, whether it be in softwood, whether it be in auto, whether it be on dairy and supply management. We will always stand up and defend Canada's interests. We will not, however, talk in great detail about our negotiation strategy. Canadians know we will defend their interests. We will continue to fight hard for Canadian jobs and for growth for the middle class, because that's what Canadians expect of us.
Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly.
Fighting with his new independent Senate over splitting the infrastructure bank from the omnibus budget bill. But if the Liberals had kept their promises and worked with parliamentarians, not used budget omnibus bills, they wouldn't be in this awkward, difficult situation. And Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister revealed his hand last week at committee when he said it would be, quote, absurd to tell a private company to move a project from Montreal to Winnipeg. So why are the Liberals putting corporate profit ahead of the interests of Canadians, and why won't they allow us to properly study this bill?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we made a commitment to Canadians to improve the way this place works, and that's exactly what we're doing. The budget legislation we put forward contains only elements that were actually in the budget, unlike the previous government's attempts at getting around parliamentary process. As for the work done by the Senate, we respect tremendously the hard work that senators are doing to examine and make recommendations around bills, but we certainly expect that budget bills passed in this House of Commons be passed by the Senate.
Honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly.
About respect for Parliament and passing a fundamental change to how we fund infrastructure projects without proper study is not the way to do it.
Mr. Speaker, clearly there hasn't been enough consultation, and the most obvious example of this has to do with Quebec, where the bank will be infringing on Quebec laws. A better study of the bill would have allowed more people to come and talk about it. But apparently there's no time for that under this Prime Minister. Why is the government stubbornly insisting on moving forward with this infrastructure plan without further study? Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, more than a year ago, we committed to this. The Infrastructure Bank was a clear election promise. We will continue to make investments in infrastructure that Canadians need. I understand that the members across the way want to spend a lot of time studying absolutely everything, but at some point we need to deliver the goods for Canadians. We need to deliver on public transport. We need to deliver on social infrastructure. And that is exactly what this government is doing for Quebec, for Quebecers, and for Canada.
Louis Saint-Laurent.
Honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, we know that the Prime Minister has a certain admiration for China's dictatorship. We also know that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money to invest in a bank in Asia. We also know that the Prime Minister welcomed Chinese billionaires who donated to his father's foundation. But all of this does not allow the Prime Minister to endanger Canada's national security. Why didn't the Prime Minister oversee the sale of Norsat? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, national security is an absolute priority for our government. All of the transactions are reviewed under the law, and they are submitted to a security review process, which has several steps. We can confirm that under the law, the process was very carefully followed, and that it was determined that there was no risk to national security. During the process, our security agents had access to all of the information they needed. We never compromised national security, and we will never compromise it in the future. Honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. I have a lot of respect for my colleague's style, but unfortunately, my question was for the Prime Minister, and he needs to tell Canadians what the issue is with national security. The government says that everything was done according to the rules, but there's one thing left for the Prime Minister to do to reassure not only Canadians but also our NATO allies, whether in US or in Europe, because they're wondering about our national security. Why is the government refusing to table all of the documents concerning the Norsat scandal? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we listened to our national security experts. We listened to their advice, and after they examined the transaction, they studied the facts. And it was based on their advice and their recommendations that we authorized this transaction. I want to reassure this House and all Canadians that we will never compromise Canada's national security, and we will always act to defend our national interests.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Norsat scandal, the Liberals just can't keep their story straight. First, the Prime Minister claimed the U.S. is on board, but they aren't. Then he said the deal was subject to a strict national security review, but it wasn't. In fact, the Prime Minister's own cabinet decided to skip that review. Wow. This deal puts Canada and the U.S. at risk. Without rigid security checks, the Liberals still gave it the green light. Will the Liberals listen to the concerns of the U.S., our closest friend and ally, and put Canadian safety first?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, national security is our priority, and we take it very seriously. All the investments reviewed under the Canada Investment Act are subject to a multi-stage national security review process conducted by our security agencies. That process was followed. The national security community conducted a review, consulted who they had to consult, had the facts in front of them, Mr. Speaker, and gave us a recommendation that this transaction did not put into jeopardy national security. No transaction, Mr. Speaker, would take place if it did not uphold and satisfy this criterion.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are hiding how dangerous this deal is for both Canada and the U.S. Nobody buys that. Michael Wessel from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission said this: the sale of Norsat to a Chinese entity raises significant national security concerns for the United States, as the company is a supplier to our military. The Liberals claim they've consulted the U.S., but they won't say who or why or how or when. Nothing adds up. Will the minister finally tell Canadians which U.S. officials they consulted with and if they agreed with this deal?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm quite frankly surprised that the party opposite doesn't trust our national security agencies and doesn't trust the opinions that they give. Mr. Speaker, we have a process in place under the Investment Canada Act. We followed that process. Our security agencies are required to consult, to investigate, and to have all the facts in front of them. They did that, Mr. Speaker. They gave us their opinion. We followed that opinion. Our national security has never been put at risk.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, Canada and our allies depend on satellite communications to safely perform peace and security operations around the world. The news that the Liberal government has fast-tracked the sale of Norsat is causing the U.S. government to review its use of Norsat components. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because they feel it could put their operations and their people at risk. My question is for the Minister of National Defence. Why is this Liberal government putting the security of Canada and our allies at risk, all to appease the Chinese government?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. We are not compromising our national security. We are not compromising our national interest. We are, in fact, trying to balance our national interest, Mr. Speaker. We relied on a process, Mr. Speaker, that put our national security first and foremost. That process was followed. Our national security agencies did their due diligence. They investigated the transaction. They had all the facts in front of them. Mr. Speaker, they gave us their opinion. We're following that opinion. We trust our national security agencies. We will never put our security at risk.
The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has attended Cash for Access fundraisers with Chinese billionaires. He's publicly expressed his admiration for the basic dictatorship in China. Chinese interests are funding a statue of his father. And now the Prime Minister is fast-tracking the sale of Canadian businesses to China without full security reviews. Our former ambassador to China has called this Prime Minister's approach naive and worrying. I agree, Mr. Speaker. Has the government House Leader asked the Ethics Commissioner about possible conflicts of interest with respect to the Prime Minister and transactions involving China?
Good question.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, there's a very clear process envisioned under the Investment Canada Act. It's a multi-step process that requires our national security agencies to look at the facts, get the facts in front of them, and make a national security recommendation. We followed that process, Mr. Speaker, to the letter. We followed their advice. We trust our national security agencies who have done their due diligence, and we have undertaken this multi-step process as it should have been undertaken.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. At the prodding of the OECD, Canada has signed dozens of information sharing agreements with tax havens. That's supposed to increase transparency, but actually transparency has simply facilitated tax evasion. So the small flaw in the law has actually become a huge gift to big corporations. Over the last 5 years, at least $55 billion of profits went untaxed by the Canada Revenue Agency. And we can't even know if they use these agreements to help fight tax evasion because they refuse to answer journalist questions. What do they have to hide? Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to fighting tax evasion and tax havens to ensure the fairness of our tax system for all Canadians. I'm proud of the leadership role that we have taken on the international stage. By increasing our level of collaboration with international partners, we're playing an active role, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we have a fair tax system. Our government will continue to inform Canadians of the efforts that are being made to fight against tax evasion and avoidance.
Well,
because that answer was so gosh darn convincing, I've got another one for the Minister. Her Liberal government is refusing to reveal to Canadians important information about tax cheats, even after this Minister's promised to reveal important information about tax cheats. The minister's office now says it's not their responsibility to release this information. Really, it's not their responsibility to tackle tax evasion and keep the minister's own promises. So if the minister isn't running her department, can she tell us who the heck is? And if she won't do her job, should she at least find somebody who can?
Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, concerning foreign tax evasion, the agency is currently carrying out audits of more than 820 taxpayers, and there are even criminal investigations in several cases. We have information sharing agreements and conventions, and they are bearing fruit, Mr. Speaker. To ensure the fairness of our tax system, this is being done. Fraudsters will no longer be able to hide, and they will have to suffer the consequences, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Well, it's becoming clear that the Prime Minister's approval to sell Canadian senior care facilities to Anbang Insurance of China has placed our seniors at risk. Questions went unanswered when the deal was first linked and inked, but the Liberals said everything would be just fine. Now Anbang's chairman, Mr. Wu, has been arrested by Chinese officials on corruption charges. Anbang's assets, including the BC retirement homes, are now at risk of being taken over by the Chinese government with so many warning signs. Why didn't the Prime Minister do any due diligence before he approved this deal?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government is open to investments that create jobs, growth and long-term prosperity for Canadians. While the official opposition continues with its scare tactics and fear-mongering, let's talk about the facts. The day-to-day operations of the residences will continue to be managed by Retirement Concepts, the same management that was there before. Rules are not changing. The residents will continue to be subject to the same robust provincial health regulations that have always applied to them. The residents and healthcare workers will continue to be protected by the same legislation. Mr. Speaker, we did our homework on this transaction. We assured what we had to make certain, and we've done it.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Innovation Minister assured the House that the government had done their homework and there was no reason for Canadians to be concerned, and he passed the buck to BC to regulate these homes. Anbang is a company with murky ownership built on risky investments. U.S. and Chinese regulators have raised serious concerns over their dealings, and when the wolves of Wall Street won't touch Anbang, how can the Liberals use vulnerable seniors as pawns for the Prime Minister's insatiable appetite to cozy up to China?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the application by Cedar Tree to acquire Retirement Concepts has been approved by under the Investment Canada Act because the acquisition will result in a net economic benefit to Canada. As a result of that review, Cedar Tree has agreed to maintain the current level of full-time and part-time employees, maintain a current Canadian operator, Retirement Concepts, to continue to manage the business, not close or repurpose any of the existing residents, and to financially support the expansion of the business. This will remain in place for a significant period of time. Mr. Speaker, we reviewed the transaction under the Investment Canada Act. The Government of British Columbia is doing his part.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals keep telling us that they take judicial appointments seriously. Yet to date, there are still judicial vacancies right across this country. Now, under our Conservative government, we appointed more than 500 judicial appointments. Now, I say to the government, if they're incapable of doing their job, the opposition would be more than happy to do it for them. These delays in the criminal justice system must end, and criminals must be prosecuted. When are the Liberals going to start taking this job seriously and fill all the judicial vacancies without excuses?
When? Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take my responsibility to appoint Superior Court justices in this country incredibly serious. I am very pleased to have introduced a new appointments process that is open and transparent. Very happy to have appointed 77 justices across the country to the Superior Courts. I will continue to appoint justices to the Superior Courts to fill the vacancies, and we will continue to work collaboratively with the provinces and territories to ensure that we have substantive solutions to address the realities of the delays that exist in the criminal justice system across the country.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice likes to say that she is proud of her record. Is the Minister proud of the near historic number of judicial vacancies? Is the minister proud of the fact that nearly half of the judicial advisory committees remain vacant? Is the minister proud of the dozens of serious criminal cases that have been thrown out of court due to her inaction, with thousands more at risk? How can the minister say that she is proud of that record with a straight face?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm incredibly proud of the 77 meritorious, diverse...
Order. Members soon will be undoubtedly leaving Ottawa, and we'll have the chance to make do lots of yelling if they want, perhaps in their own ridings outside of Ottawa. But I'm asking members to try to restrain themselves, at least for the next few days, and then maybe they'll have a chance on occasion to even yell for one of these days. Or something like that, if they have to. The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, I'm incredibly proud of the 77 substantive, meritorious Superior Court justices that I've been able to appoint thus far. More appointments are going to be coming. The appointees represent the diversity that is our great country. I'm going to continue to make these appointments. Likewise, I'm going to continue to substantively work with my counterparts in the provinces and territories to address the call of the Supreme Court of Canada to ensure that there is a culture change among all actors in the criminal justice system. There is no one solution to this. We are working.
The
Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal approach to official languages is a real farce. The Minister of Heritage forgot to extend the mandate for the acting commissioner, and we no longer have had a watchdog for official languages since Saturday. Prior to that, there was the partisan appointment of Madeleine Meyer with contempt for the Act of Parliament, and this is the work of the minister who says official languages is a priority for our government. Really? When will the government sort this situation out and respect the Official Languages Act? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind my colleague that our official languages are important for this government. Having said that, we will have an Official Languages Commissioner. Operations continue at the office of the Commissioner, and I will have an opportunity to make an announcement shortly. The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Well, millions of Canadians were celebrating Father's Day. Najawi, Miriam, and Dowdy, the children of Raif Badawi, were sadly dealing with the absence of their father, who's been away for 5 years. The three children directly sent out a plea to the Prime Minister asking him to pick up the phone and call the King of Saudi Arabia so that their father could come home. In 2015, prior to the election, the member for Papineau urged Mr. Harper to step in personally. So what is the Prime Minister doing today to help the children of Raif Badawi? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The case of Mr. Badawi at the highest level with the Saudi government. We continue to ask for clemency so he is reunited with his family. I've had the opportunity and the privilege of meeting with his wife on multiple occasions. I've reassured her that our government, our Prime Minister, our Minister of Foreign Affairs are engaged on this case. We will continue to appeal for Mr. Badawi's clemency.
Member for Don Valley West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For decades, the Canadian government actively discriminated against gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans and queer Canadians. Thousands of public servants and military personnel were fired for their sexual orientation, forced to live double lives or risk loss of employment or even criminal conviction. I'm proud of our government's efforts to build stronger ties with my community, working for rights at home and abroad. But still more remains to be done. Could the Minister of Justice update us on steps the government is taking to heal the wounds in the LGBTQ2 community?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague, the member from Don Valley West, for the question. I am incredibly proud of the work that our government is doing. In Canada, we embrace diversity, we embrace inclusion, and we have to ensure that everybody has the freedom to be who they are. That is why I'm incredibly proud that the Senate passed Bill C-16 last week. I look forward to it receiving royal assent, adding to the Canadian Human Rights Code
prohibition against gender identity and gender expression. We are doing more, looking at historic records and the expungement of them for unjust laws. And in this month of Pride, I want to celebrate and applaud the LGBT.
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastern.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' mismanagement on the fighter jet replacement has gone from a national scandal to an international embarrassment. Over the weekend, officials were instructed to meet with aerospace companies in Paris. Then they were told to cancel those meetings, and then they were told to reschedule them. The Defence Minister has made a complete mess on this file. Is there anyone on the Liberal benches, anyone at all, that can fix this comedy of errors and actually hold an open competition to replace our aging fighter jets now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is holding an open process to replace the fighter jets. This competitive process will ensure that we purchase the fighter jet that suits the needs in the long term of the Air Force and will provide Canada with benefits for our economy. We began the process for soliciting bids. Initial consultations with the industry will start in 2017. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have turned the fighter jet replacement file into a real farce, and this farce is being played out on the international scene. The government opposite is incapable of organizing simple meetings with representatives of the aerospace industry. And if we add to that that most stakeholders have completely lost confidence in the Minister of Defence, this issue is a huge mess. Does the Prime Minister understand the scope of the problem? Will he call his minister to order and finally set up an open and transparent process? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. I'd like to remind my colleague opposite that the Chief of the Defence Staff, when the policy was announced, said this was good for people in uniform. Yes, we are equipping our Canadian Forces members with what they need to complete their missions. We have commitments with NORAD, with NATO, and that's why we want to ensure that we replace our equipment, our aging equipment, to ensure that our men and women in uniform can accomplish the missions they are assigned to here and abroad.
Well, Mr. Speaker, nobody trusts the Liberals to actually deliver on that promise. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals unveiled their defence and foreign policies, and surprise, surprise, there were no details of a UN peacekeeping mission in either of them. It's been almost a year since the Prime Minister naively promised 600 troops to a vague UN peacekeeping mission. Now, documents show that the Liberals have turned down 5 UN leadership roles and won't commit to a single UN mission. Now, the Prime Minister says Canada is back. Well, now he's backing away from UN peacekeeping missions after stepping back from the fight against ISIS. When will the Prime Minister finally step up and quit embarrassing?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the member knows, Canada did announce that it was back in the world and will play a significant role in international multilateral institutions, including as a determined peace builder returning to peace support operations. That was a commitment of our government, and we will restore Canada's role in peace support missions. We're taking our time thoughtfully to decide what mission Canada will lead in, and we're doing that because that's what Canadians expect of us. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, almost a year after the Prime Minister's ill-advised promise to send 600 troops to a vague peacekeeping mission, we still don't know anything about it. The Liberals could have included details in their defence policy or the statement on foreign policy, but there again, nothing. Now we've learned that Canada has refused 5 different offers from the UN. Could the Prime Minister finally set the record straight for our troops instead of using them as pawns simply to earn a seat on the Security Council? Mr. Speaker, Canada remains resolved to its commitments to the UN, peacekeeping missions, peace stabilization missions, including within the UN. These are duties assigned to Canadian forces protecting security. As part of the new policy, we have reaffirmed our determination to continue in a tangible way and to provide value added to UN peacekeeping missions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For London Fanshawe.
Mr. Speaker, veteran suicides devastate our communities. There are too many unanswered questions regarding why so many veterans turn to self-harm. Mr. Lionel Desmond not only ended his own life, but also the lives of his daughter, his partner, and his mother. This terrible tragedy needs to be examined. Will the Minister take responsibility and call an inquiry into the triple murder-suicide of Lionel Desmond to shed some light and find remedies for our veterans who are suffering?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Suicide by a veteran is always a tragedy. We are working in conjunction with the Department of Veterans Affairs to put in place a system to provide better support to veterans and their families, and to ensure that not only are we doing the right things, but that we are leaders in this area. In Budget 2017, we announced the opening of a Centre for Excellence in Mental Health, PTSD, to advance practices, exemplary practices, and to help reduce the stigmas surrounding it.
That was an inquiry my colleague called for. Today, the Minister unveiled a strategy on gender-based violence. While we do need data and RCMP training, there's absolutely nothing for frontline services to support survivors of sexual assault. Every night, 500 women and kids are turned away from domestic violence shelters in Canada. 500. So why does this so-called anti-violence strategy have absolutely nothing for women fleeing violence and for the frontline workers who support them?
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to ensuring that all women and girls can live free from violence. This is why we are investing $100.9 million in a strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. The strategy we released today, Mr. Speaker, is based on prevention, support for survivors and their families, and promoting responsive legal and justice systems. And it will build a solid foundation for action and fill important gaps in support for survivors of gender-based violence. Mr. Speaker, today was a very good day in the fight against gender-based violence.
Very good. Well, member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, last week the courts ruled that Onion Lake Cree Nations must post their financial transparency information in accordance with financial transparency Act. This is a great victory for Charmaine Stick and those across the country. We now have a judgment that clearly states the minister was irresponsible and wrong in not enforcing the act. Will she commit today that she will empower band members and no other person will have to take their band to court for transparency, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, the government agrees that First Nations individuals should be able to access their community's financial information. We have already launched national mutual accountability engagements with First Nations, community leaders and members, including both in-person and online engagements. We have also been working on a mutual accountability for almost a year with the AFN and the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association. Everyone, including First Nations governments, wants increased transparency and accountability, and we will achieve this in the coming months, working in partnership with First Nations.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, it has been 18 months and they're doing nothing to enforce a law. Water, and let me read from the court judgment. There is no evidence before me as to the political or economic reasons why Onion Lake has refused to provide and post specified information. There is, for example, no evidence that Onion Lake's commercial interests would be negatively impacted. Will the minister follow the direction of the judge, or is she going to force more band members to plead their case in front of the courts, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, our government takes mutual accountability seriously. All contribution agreements between our government and First Nations contain strong reporting provisions to ensure that funds are used as intended. We remain committed to establishing a new fiscal relationship with First Nations, including strengthened mutual accountability measures. In supporting of this commitment, my department is currently engaging from coast to coast to coast with First Nations leadership and community members.
Honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, that's a lot of words that say that the minister is refusing to enforce the law. Why can't she just stand up and say, I am refusing to enforce the law here? And does she realize that as a result of her negligence, band members are having to go to court to get information that is rightly entitled to him?
That's right.
Why is the minister defending the status quo instead of doing what's right for First Nations communities?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree. The government agrees that First Nations individuals should be able to access their community's financial information. We have launched a natural mutual accountability with engagement with First Nations, including in-person online engagements. Everyone, including First Nations, wants increased transparency and accountability, and we will achieve this by working in close collaboration with First Nations.
The Honourable Member for Hull-Aylmer. Last Tuesday, we learned that search warrants were carried out in Toronto and in the UK. And this was in connection with a criminal investigation on a GST-HST tax fraud scheme affecting both countries. The reports indicate that this carousel tax fraud scheme was to obtain $52 million in false tax credit refunds. Can the Minister of National Revenue inform this House of the CRA's efforts to fight fraud? Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the colleague for Hull-Aylmer for his question. The government committed to fighting tax evasion and tax avoidance. That is why we invested nearly $1 billion as part of our last two budgets to equip ourselves with the necessary tools for fighting this effectively. Based on the preliminary results, we should be recovering more than $13 billion for the fiscal year which ended March 31st, 2017. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to prosecuting people committing international fraud alongside our international partners and bringing them to justice.
This 150th just around the corner. Canadians have much to celebrate, and we'll be celebrating with an amazing craft beer, wine and spirits. But in typical Liberal fashion, as we raise a glass to celebrate Canada, they are finding new ways to raise taxes to pay for their out-of-control spending. This year and every following year, the Liberals will be raising taxes on beer, wine and spirits, despite the fact that we already pay some of the highest taxes in the world. So can the Minister please explain that the only promise he's willing to keep is the promise to raise taxes and tax the fun out of our Canada Day celebrations?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's always a pleasure to rise in this House and to talk about the good work that our government is doing. The first thing that we did, Mr. Speaker, when we took office, we lowered taxes for middle-class Canadians while raising them for the wealthiest 1%. We also put in place the Canada Child Benefit Program that has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we also increased the Guaranteed Income Supplement by 10% for low-income seniors. Mr. Speaker, we'll keep on working for Canadians. That's exactly what we'll be doing. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Courtenay, Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, I recently met with executive members of the BC Fruit Growers Association and the Canadian Horticultural Council, representing produce growers in my riding of Kootenay, Columbia. They told me that Canadian growers suffer greatly when their buyer fails to pay them due to bankruptcy. The Standing Committee on Agriculture unanimously urged the Minister to develop a payment protection model for Canada's growers, but nothing has happened. It's been a year, Mr. Speaker. When will the government take action to protect our fruit and vegetable growers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to the success of the fruit and vegetable sector. We will be looking at how we can support this important Canadian industry by working on a national policy as the new strategic framework. We will continue to support the entire agricultural sector and farmers across the country through our budget with the support of the science, innovation and competitiveness sector. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Oakville North, Burlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Far too many Canadians still face violence every day simply because of their gender expression, gender identity or perceived gender. Our Status of Women Committee, of which I am Vice Chair, studied this issue, and I think we would all agree that it's time for us to take action. Budget 2017 committed $100.9 million for a gender-based violence strategy. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Status of Women update this House on the status of this strategy?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member from Oakville, North Burlington, for the question and her leadership on gender equality. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to join the Minister of the Status of Women this morning as she announced our government's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. Again, our strategy is based on prevention, support for survivors and their families, and promoting responsive legal and justice systems. And our approach will build a solid foundation for action, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's time for Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence.
Member for Central Okanagan, order.
Mr. Speaker, these Liberals just can't help themselves. They love picking winners and losers by imposing big government regulations. Now the Liberals are targeting credit unions by prohibiting their use of the terms bank and banking. Now this means if a credit union uses a term like personal banking or online banking on their promotions, they've run afoul of the rules and can face penalties between $500,000 and $5 million, Mr. Speaker. Now, can the Finance Minister explain to Canadians why his government is being so petty in the targeting of credit unions? Is it because of all of his friends on Bay Street are telling him to do this, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, credit union system is an important part of the Canadian economy that contributes to competition in the financial services. Credit unions are key suppliers of financing for small and medium-sized businesses and also for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. We have encouraged the Office of the Superintendent of Institutions to get in touch with credit unions and to work collaboratively to ensure that they come up with a solution that can work for both. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, the Patriote Verchères. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-44 needs to be split and the Infrastructure Privatization Bank needs to be removed. A stop must be put to the practice of using these mammoth bills with poison pills hidden in 500-page documents. This infrastructure bank is a bad idea for Quebec. It will weaken Quebec to the benefit of others. Will the Prime Minister listen to Quebec, farmers, and even the Senate and split Bill C-44 and remove the infrastructure bank?
Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect us to build the best public transit to reduce the gridlock facing our communities. They want us to invest in more affordable housing to create opportunities for Canadians. They want us to invest in recreational, cultural infrastructure. That's exactly what our infrastructure plan, ambitious $186 billion plan, will do so. As far as respecting the jurisdiction of provinces and municipalities, the bank will do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand what the Liberals don't understand. As drafted in Bill C-44, the Infrastructure Bank can ignore Quebec legislation, bypass municipal bylaws and regulation. There's no agricultural zonage. They can expropriate. Those are the effects of C-44. We've said it. Constitutional experts have said it. So have the National Assembly and agriculture producers and even the Senate. When will the government finally listen to us, split the bill, and remove the Infrastructure Bank from it?
Infrastructure.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am so proud to be working with our Quebec caucus to deliver on the commitments that we made to all Canadians, including the province of Quebec. $1.3 billion investment in Montreal's transit system will create 34,000 jobs in the region. That is delivering for Canadians. That is delivering for the province of Quebec. As far as the legislation is concerned, we are very confident that the way it's designed, it will respect the local jurisdiction in Quebec and in other provinces.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, forestry workers from across Quebec are calling for the negotiation of a fair and equitable softwood lumber agreement. Now, this may seem obvious, but the forestry sector is now suspicious of Ottawa after, in fact, stalling on guarantees. That's cost weeks of work for our people who need some stability. Will the government take the time to doing something so that this, to help the Quebec workers?
The question, because it's a chance to remind the House of the significant degree that we have gone to make sure, both in the short term and the long term, that the forestry industry is respected in Canada. That includes $605 million from the Export Development Corporation. That includes very timely measures to expand export markets. That includes taking the leaders of the industry in Quebec to China to begin to make the argument that our wood is the best wood in the world. We're very proud of that initiative. We're very proud how we have stood up for the forestry